and we're going to learn about ethical problems in gender identity construction. So just a very short bit real quick. Hyacinth Piel is a graduate student who is studying philosophy at UIC. Z lives in Edgewater with Horgy, and I'm going to mispronounce Horgy's name. Pogibonsi?
Yeah.
All right. So thank you for Pogibonsi for me not mispronouncing your name. So without further ado, please welcome to the podium Hyacinth.
Am I using this mic correctly? Everyone? Here we go. So, some familiar slogans of the trans liberation movement taken from Leslie Feinberg's programmatic book, 1998, called just the Trans Liberation. People of all genders have the right to explore femininity, masculinity, and the infinite variations between without criticism or ridicule. And another one, each person has the right to express their gender in any way that feels most comfortable. So from here we have the template for something like a movement oriented toward the enlargement of expressive freedom. Okay. And I wanted to start to think about what the limits of that kind of project might be and ways that it might need to get more complicated as the movement grows. So we want to run up against one limit to this kind of political program when we consider that gender is not just an individual thing, something you do on your own. It's a form of identification and a collection of behaviors rooted in a social institution of gender inequality. Gender in the contemporary Eurocentric context is governed by two intertwining dynamics. And the first one is, on the basis of whether our bodies look male or female to the people around us, initially doctors and parents, but eventually everyone, including the impersonal coercive institutions that comprise the state, we are tracked into one or the other of exactly two officially recognized social kinds, called genders. If we are taken to look female, we will be raised as girls and thence made to develop into women. As alleged girls or women, we will be expected to behave in certain ways and punished or killed for failing to do so. If we are taken to look male, we will be raised as boys and made to develop into men. And as both boys and men, we will be expected to behave in certain ways and punished or killed for failing to do so. If we are initially taken to look both insufficiently male and insufficiently female, our bodies will be mutilated so that they look more male or female. Evidence of the mutilation will be covered up, and then we will be raised either as girls into women or as boys into men, and, of course, punished or killed for failing to comply with conventional behavioral expectations for members of these gender groups. From a transgender and intersex freedom point of view, this is the shape of the gender world we all inhabit. Following Julia Serrano, I will call this part of the gender system, in which, on the basis of body shape or genital appearance, we are tracked into two non-overlapping social groups and compelled to act in accordance with the going expectations for members of these groups, oppositional sexism. Okay. So that's the sort of first governing dynamic of gender as we know it in our field, oppositional sexism. Second, the genders constituted through the practices of oppositional sexism are not merely socially different, they are unequal. I should acknowledge that the social dynamics I'm trying to generalize about are the ones that hold sway in the dominant American discursive and cultural contexts, which are skewed heavily toward the white and middle class. And things can certainly play out quite differently in communities that are differently raised or classed. But in this mainstream, dominant middle class, predominantly white context, the so-called boys and men are both trained and presumed to be active, aggressive, self-interested, independent, strong, rational subjects. So-called girls or women are both trained and presumed to be passive, self-sacrificing, dependent, weak, emotional, and objective. Adopting another term from Serrano, I shall call this an egalitarian distribution of privilege and disadvantage to men and what is masculine on the one hand, and to women and what is feminine on the other, hierarchical sexism. Okay, so that's the second one. We have oppositional and hierarchical forms of sexism. While many trans people oppose the injustices of hierarchical sexism, I think we can say without too much oversimplification that the trans movement's primary political target so far has been dismantling oppositional sexism in order to protect and extend rights of free gender expression to everyone, regardless of birth assigned sex. This has led to a focus on gender as an individual affair, an aspect of one's identity that one ought to be at liberty to express as one sees fit. And in this liberal individualist sort of framework, in which the free expression of gender is valorized, the relational aspects of gender, how our gender expressions affect others, and the dimension of social group-based privilege and disadvantage in which gender is implicated by hierarchical sexism, can get lost or forgotten. One of my main aims in this lecture will be to counter this forgetfulness with a reminder that the practice of gender expression and the inescapable personal task of constructing gender identity must have an ethical dimension. Now, trans people have good reason to get nervous about the suggestion that there must be an ethics of gender identity and performance, because the need for an ethics implies that gender can be done well or badly, and we are rightly sick to death of being told that we are doing it wrong. And as a gender non-conforming person, I am quite well aware of the grotesque falsity and cruelty of cissexist moralism about gender. But how we should live is one of the most vital questions we face as self-conscious agents. We cannot afford to give up asking the question simply because many of the people around us mindlessly accept some foolish answers to it. And we cannot figure out how to live without figuring out what to do about gender. I believe that as trans people, we are, as W.E.B. Du Bois said of African Americans, gifted with second sight. And that because of this, we are in an especially advantageous position to make progress in the ethics of gender. The everyday conduct of gender in Eurocentered society is frequently inegalitarian and destructive. This is a hierarchical dimension of sexism. First of all, because gender as we know it began its historical life and has come down to us through the millennia as hierarchy in the form of patriarchy. And the only way any of us ever learn to do gender, or even what it is through the exchange and transmission of stereotypes, most or all of which still bear the marks of a bloody history of cruelty, domination, and the interfusion of love with terror and surrender. These violent and hierarchical dimensions of gender have been emphasized and opposed by feminists, but the movement for trans liberation has not always been sufficiently sensitive to them, in part because the liberal individualist vocabulary of enlarging rights to unencumbered gender expression has a hard time accommodating the insight that hierarchy and the systemic subordination of social groups can be maintained through the free expressive actions of individuals. Part of what it means to expand the ethical perspective of trans liberation is to suggest that the movement should not be dedicated to the uncritical affirmation of all forms of gender expression, since some of these contribute to oppression, and its rhetoric, the rhetoric of the trans movement as it evolves, should reflect a recognition that the gender identities and performances that come naturally to us are not sacrosanct. They may need to be revised for the sake of inclusiveness and justice. One of the tools I found useful for me for starting to think through these questions about how to incorporate a sharper ethical dimension into the trans liberation movement comes from the late queer philosopher Joyce Trebilcock. In a prescient 1975 paper entitled Two Forms of Androgynism, Treblecott starts off from the premise that, quote, traditional concepts of men, women and men, of what we are and should be as females and males, and that the implications of sex for our relationships to one another and for our places in society are not acceptable, end quote. Treblecott then explores the advantages and disadvantages of two androgynous alternatives to the current gender regime, which they call monoandrogynism and polyandrogynism. In both monoandrogynism and polyandrogynism, the link is broken between birth-assigned sex and normative gender category. Gender performances are no longer judged to be appropriate or inappropriate, depending on whether the person doing them was or is believed to have been born male or female. Under both gender ideals, people will not be tracked into femininity because they are thought to have female bodies, or tracked into masculinity because they are thought to have male bodies. The same gender identity and presentation options will be equally open to all people, regardless of assigned sex. Although Treblecott does not say so, I believe we can charitably extend their story to suggest that under both monoandrogynism and polyandrogynism, people who are born intersex would not be subjected, as they are today, to damaging and unwanted surgeries meant to force their bodies into narrowly male or female molds, because the uncoupling of bodily sex assignment from normative gender performance would diminish or abolish the social relevance of birth-assigned sex. Without the social requirement that one be masculine or feminine and treated accordingly, depending on whether one's body is male or female, the importance of having a clearly male or female body would likewise fall away. Now, if Treblecott's monoandrogynism and polyandrogynism are alike in affording all of us equal access to acceptable forms of gender presentation, regardless of birth-assigned sex, they differ in what they regard as the acceptable forms of gender presentation. The ideas are really quite different, and their attractions pull us in opposite directions, despite the fact that they both posit some sort of androgyny, or a combination of masculine and feminine traits, as an ideal of human character development. As the Greek-derived prefix mono indicates, monoandrogynism prescribes a single gender ideal for everyone, a mixture of the best aspects of masculinity and femininity, purged of the retrograde and inegalitarian aspects of each of the traditional forms. Under this ideal, everyone would strive to display some ideal balance of traits traditionally coded as masculine. Now, unlike monoandrogynism, polyandrogynism does not posit a single gender ideal for everyone. Treblecott sometimes describes mono and polyandrogynism using the image of a spectrum, ranging from pure femininity to pure masculinity. The idea is that in a polyandrogynous society, everyone, regardless of birth-assigned sex, would be entitled to occupy any position along this single spectrum to express any gender that's voted. We can imagine two friendly revisions to this way of conceptualizing polyandrogyny. First, it turns out that this picture of a single spectrum is inadequate, because it falsely implies that being more masculine makes someone less feminine, and vice versa. The closer you get to one end of the spectrum, the further you get from the other in the single spectrum view. But this really needn't be the case. Someone could be very masculine in some ways without their body losing their femininity. So perhaps we should imagine two parallel spectra from more to less masculinity and from more to less femininity. Or we could picture a two-dimensional plane where masculinity is plotted along the x-axis and femininity along the y-axis. On this grid, there could be the people down here who, agendered people, for example, or neutrals, who aren't particularly masculine or feminine. People who are very feminine and also very masculine, and in the middle, people who are somewhere in the middle along both of the dimensions. Now, Treblecott also seems to picture each person's gender as stable over time, whereas these days we are more apt to picture gender as potentially very fluid, changing even from one day or one moment to the next. But it should be clear that the polyandrogynous ideal can be adjusted to accommodate both of these insights. that a person's gender may be fluid over time, and that masculinity and femininity are not really opposite to each other in the way that was commonly assumed in the past. An increase in one need not mean a corresponding decrease in the other, as the single spectrum supposed. So we can redescribe polyandrogenism as the view that anyone, regardless of birth assigned sex, should be able to express any combination of feminine and masculine traits that speaks to them, and to modify their gender presentation and their gendered sense of self as often as they see fit.
Your gender presentation and their what?
Gendered sense of self. That's what
I still live here.
Gendered sense of self.
Sense of self. Okay, thank you.
Monoandrogenism, that's the other one, not the one we've been talking about here. Monoandrogenism with the single ideal has clearly fallen out of favor since its heyday in the women's liberation era of the 1970s. As blogger Cliff Privocracy remarks, it never managed to overcome its association with the nightmare vision of, quote, a society of people with shaved heads in gray coveralls, addressing each other coolly as comrade, and regarding sexual passion as a primitive relic. End of quote. In other words, a society in which the brilliance, diversity, excitement, and eroticism made possible by gender difference has given way to a boring and colorless world in which everyone is equal because everyone is the same. As the monoandrogynous picture has gone into eclipse, some sort of polyandrogenism has become the sort of rallying ideal of the trans movement. As a trans person, I have a lot of sympathy for it, and I certainly believe that a more polyandrogynous culture would be a huge improvement over the cissexist patriarchy of the status quo, which is characterized by the twin dynamics I have followed Serrano in calling oppositional and hierarchical sexism. So now let me dwell for a minute on what the advantages of polyandrogenism would seem to be. Okay, so how would polyandrogenism improve on the status quo? For one thing, as we've already seen, under polyandrogenism, people would not be restricted in their gender expressions on the basis of physical sex. Traits and expressions that are now associated with masculinity and allowed or encouraged only in male-assigned people would be open to all, as with those traits and expressions which are currently associated with femininity and allowed or encouraged only in female-assigned people. And this would make for a huge net increase in human freedom of expression, which is what the trans movement wanted. Right? Since by hypothesis, under polyandrogenism, people would find their own gender paths and lead their own gendered lives without fear that their preferred forms of expression would be punished as inappropriate to people with bodies like theirs. And this would represent a huge reduction in violence and unjust coercion, since it is evident that oppositional sexism, the forced alignment of male bodies with masculinity and non-femininity, and female bodies with femininity and non-masculinity, to say nothing of the maintenance of the gender line through the concerted surgical mutilation of intersex bodies, requires high levels of violence and discipline to maintain, all of which would be odious and unnecessary, and would be clearly recognized for the evil it is under a polyandrogynous society. So, less violence. This is not to say that all violence would melt away, because there would still be other forms of social hierarchy. Now, some feminists really hate this polyandrogynous idea. Most notoriously, the so-called trans exclusionary radicalists, people like Sheila Jeffries, Leah Keith of Deep Green Resistance, and Kathy Brennan of the hate group Gender Identity Watch. These folks oppose the polyandrogynous basis of trans politics and reject the very legitimacy of our trans identities, because they think that gender justice must involve the abolition of gender difference. As a contingent of these activists put it in a recent open letter, quote, "We look forward to freedom from gender, the freedom for gender movement," which I'm calling a polyandrogynous movement, whatever the intentions of its supporters, is reinforcing the culture and institutions of gender that are oppressing women. I want to make it clear that I have no sympathy for this turf view, which regards gender difference as so inseparable from dominance and the oppression of women that it concludes that all gender differences and our transgender identities along with them must be eradicated. However, I do believe, for some related feminist reasons, that the polyandrogynous paradigm of trans politics ought to be complicated, confronted, and supplemented with other ideas. In particular, I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about the attractions of what Travelcott calls monoandrogynism. Remember, monoandrogynism agrees with polyandrogynism that gender should be uncoupled from birth-assigned sex, but departs from polyandrogynism in positing a single gender ideal for everyone to aspire to.